Watch out!
New game? Same conversation. Pokemon Legends EA recently got its first gameplay trailer, and with it came conflicting opinions on the game's presentation. Plenty of other aspects of Pokemon games are argued over with each new entry, but by far the most prominent one revolves around graphics. Die-hard fans want the best for the franchise and demand the visuals be better, while other die-hard fans demand no one critique their favorite game series because graphics aren't as important as gameplay. Both sides have validity in parts, and I'm not just saying that to both sides of the situation, it's just the honest truth. There really is something to be said about how Game Freak only invites this discourse on themselves. We can all acknowledge that a fun game can be fun despite graphics, but there also comes a point when a game presents itself so poorly that it's hard to interact with the game underneath. Now, do I think Pokemon Legends EA is such a game? No. I'll be transparent about that up front. I think ZA is a decent graphical upgrade from Scarlet and Violet, even if there are some regressions made along the way. To me, it's visually more cohesive and seems to run much smoother based on footage and coding techniques that we're seeing from the trailer. Can and should it look better? Yeah. Do I really need to remind you for the millionth time that Pokemon is the most profitable media franchise in existence? That the developers of the mainline games refuse to grow their studio at the rate necessary for their insanely frequent release schedule? Gosh, I really hope I didn't need to remind you, but I just did anyway, because context is always important. Context also dictates that we should acknowledge that Pokemon Legends EA's graphics could very well be improved as dramatically between now and release as much as BDSP's were. That game had a similar reveal to release schedule, and the difference in presentation between its first and second trailer was night and day. Lighting techniques were added, depth of field effects were added, particle effects, anti-aliasing, and heck, entire assets like trees were switched out for better ones. Even the website for that title was changed accordingly as new footage was released to the public. And sure, that wasn't a Game Freak game, but then, let's pretend for a moment that what we currently see of Legends EA is what we'll get on release. Do I think it's the best looking mainline Pokemon game on Switch? No. But is it serviceable? Could I interact with the game underneath it in its current state and not be constantly distracted? Well, I'm leaning towards a confident yes. Nothing on screen so far screams out to me and takes me out of the game. Well, except maybe how small the Sonics is, but hey, it might just be a small variant, time will tell. Anyways, if you want great examples of graphical and artistic issues that can distract from gameplay experience, we don't have to go back very far. Pokemon has been full of them, and don't worry, while we're going to take the time to talk about which ones are the worst offenders, we'll also discuss some of the best and how Game Freak learned their lessons and corrected their issues in subsequent releases. Alright, you all know the scapegoat, it's Pokemon Sword and Shield. Game Freak's first attempt at a new mainline title on a home console. This game made it very clear that Game Freak was not used to creating 3D games, and they definitely didn't prepare themselves for the day that they would. Who can forget the plethora of graphical issues in Sword and Shield? I mean, the extremely close pop-in, the downsizing of large Pokemon, the absence of turning animations, the lack of battle animations. Oh baby, you can accuse people for nitpicking all day, but when the list grows as big as it did in Sword and Shield, you get to a point where you gotta admit, it's not cherry picking, it's just looking at the game for what it is. And what it was a mess. All of these issues are the kinds of graphical and presentation issues that can prevent the player from interacting with the game underneath because they effectively pull you out of the experience. However, these things can be avoided with proper planning and competent coding. At the time though, Game Freak just wasn't there yet. But they did literally fix all this right after. After Sword and Shield, the next game Game Freak crafted was Pokemon Legends Arceus. Graphically speaking, Arceus fixed nearly everything from Sword and Shield. It introduced LODs for every Pokemon model in the game. Now you can see your favorite Pokemon at further distances as lower poly models instead of them popping in and out of existence. Turning animations were crafted for every Pokemon. Proper size scaling was measured for Pokemon to the point where they even had alpha variants to tower over their counterparts in the game. Every Pokemon also got new animations, so every battle move showed your Pokemon being active. Physical moves required them to run up and hit the opponent. Heck, even idle animations were introduced for when your Pokemon isn't attacking yet. Game Freak showed a newfound level of coding competence with Pokemon Legends Arceus, and we were all extremely grateful for them correcting most of, if not all the mistakes we called out in Sword and Shield. And that's not even mentioning the fact that the game had far more gameplay elements to it than any previous Pokemon game, all while running snappier than all that came before. We're going to talk more about the graphics of Arceus when we tackle art styles later in this vid, but for now, let's acknowledge that a lot of these graphical improvements are present in the Legend ZA trailer as well. Meaning, we've reached a decent baseline, at least with whichever team at Game Freak is coding the Legends games. Now that being said, most of what we discussed so far has to do more with the presentation side of the graphics, but the detail and fidelity of the graphics themselves can also impact a game. Yeah, I'm gonna bring everyone's favorite topic back. Sword and Shield, get back here. Guys, there's a reason the comparison between the trees in the wild area of Sword and Shield and Nintendo 64's Ocarina of Time exists. It would all be fine in a vacuum, but when the same tree is copy-pasted all over the area you're using as your game's biggest selling point, people are gonna notice it. Over and over and over again. It's gonna break immersion and take them out of the game experience. Now, does anyone notice things like this in the trailer for Pokemon Legends EA? Not really. The worst offender is this wall in one shot of the trailer, but with how much variation we see in the footage of the city, I can let one wall slide. It doesn't seem like it'll be copy and pasted all over the entire game like the trees were in Sword and Shield's wild area. Matter of fact, I think most of the textures and patterns we see in ZA so far are quite good. They're much better than the environmental textures in Scarlet and Violet, which brings us to our next graphical topic, art style. When a developer is deciding on an art style for their game, it's important that they know what their limitations are. For Game Freak, they need to acknowledge three things. One is that they're developing for the Nintendo Switch, a system with a limited performance budget. Two, that they don't have much time to make their game relative to other game studios, and they refuse to grow their team size at the rate necessary to keep up with this. And three, that they're also a far less competent development studio than most other game developers out there. They've shown promise a time or two, but it's clear that they're just not as knowledgeable as they need to be yet. Just look at the team that made Scarlet and Violet. That game ran poorly due to improper planning and implementation of graphical systems. There's no getting around that the sooner Game Freak admits that they're incompetent and works to fix it, the better experience everyone will have, us playing the games and them making it. Now with that being said, Legends EA does show that they're finally acknowledging that last part, and that they've even grown more competent as a result of that acknowledgement. This is why failure is so important, because you learn how to get back up properly. Now the biggest thing here is how they've improved on performance, and if you want to know exactly how we know they did all that, I'll link you to my video covering it at the end of this video. But back on the topic of art style, an art style can go a long way towards giving your game visual cohesion. It can either hide flaws or showcase raw talent. Or it could do the opposite of both of those things. Once again, let's start with the worst example. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, you're back in the limelight, get out here. Alright, so Scarlet and Violet is a visual mess. It went for an exposed art style, but it never made sure to give its world a detailed look. Everything in the environment looks like mashed goop, yet the character models and Pokemon models are extremely detailed and textured. The colors of the game are fairly washed out and pastel, yet the lighting engine looks really realistic, and it has an expensive performance cost. All these differing aspects of the game's visuals do not harmonize. It's a pain to look at for the most part, and every once in a while the game can look genuinely pretty, but you kinda have to pan your camera up at the sky and only look at the characters in Pokemon. Now, those detailed characters, Pokemon, and that gorgeous lighting engine are the exact aspects that make the game perform bad. Game Freak doesn't know how to code very well, and their games are very bloated as a result. Which is especially bad on the Switch since it has a low performance budget, as I mentioned before. So conversely, let's look at when they did it right. Let's look at a good example of an art style for a Pokemon game. Pokemon Legends Arceus and Sword and Shield should be our poster children. But don't get too excited, Sword and Shield. You only count when you're not in the wild area and when, honestly, we're not seeing you in motion. Anyways, both of these games are a cel-shaded art style. Now, subjectively, I do think cel shading is the best art style for Pokemon, but objectively, it also comes with a lot of pluses for a studio like Game Freak. For one, cel shading can hide bad textures. This is extremely evident in Sword and Shield, even if no one could save those wild area trees, they were just that bad. But everything else in the game looks phenomenal because of that cel shaded art style. Again, when the game isn't in motion. Like if you look at a still of Sword and Shield, the game looks really pretty. Then you have Legends Arceus, which has noticeably better textures than Sword and Shield, but even then, it's also cel-shaded. The better textures just become a plus at that point, and it also helps that Arceus was the first game to use the new Pokemon models that had more depth and had textures added to them. Yes, the textures are present in the game, it's just harder to see them because it's cel-shaded, but when you get real close to your Pokemon, which you can do because you can literally play Pokemon Legends Arceus in first person, it's just a nice little bonus to see those scales on your Gyarados or fur on your Teddiursa. Regardless, PLA doesn't need to have as good textures as it did because of the cel-shaded art style, but it could afford them on the performance budget, so Game Freak implemented them anyway. It's the snappiest mainline Pokemon game ever made, and it still looks arguably better than any other Game Freak game in general. The color palette is surprisingly gritty for a cel-shaded title, but it works perfectly with the more serious tone and darker setting of the game world. Hisui is dangerous, it's scary, but it also takes place in the world of Pokemon. It can be beautiful at times, it can be colorful. These are examples of contrasts in your game's graphics that do harmonize, because there was thought put into it. Arguably more thought than any other Pokemon game has had on Switch. So let's bring this back to Pokemon Legends EA. This game has been smart on so many levels, and its biggest shiner is on how good the planning for this game has been. Again, I've discussed their techniques for improving performance in a separate video, I'll link you to that in a bit, but for this video, I want to focus specifically on how well the art style and graphics were planned, and how those are going to help the game visually in the long run. For one, delegating ZA to take place solely in a city is ingenious. It's as if Game Freak acknowledged that they're not the best at developing a 3D game without bloating it, so they've taken an easy route this time to allow themselves some leeway. See, this is a good example of admitting your faults because then you start to learn how to fix them. Yeah, so for example, buildings surrounding the player throughout most of your adventure is a good thing because Game Freak can make everything in your immediate area look better than they otherwise would. That's because they don't have to render whatever assets are behind the buildings until you turn a corner. On top of this, Game Freak has always had a problem with using repeated patterns, and players have complained that it looks unnatural. Well, now, in a cityscape, repeated patterns make sense, since cities can be manicured. As such, we can already see improvements to the visual presentation, thanks to higher quality assets compared to Scarlet and Violet, as well as repeated patterns looking more natural to the eye because it's to be expected from a cityscape. Now, next thing I want to cover on graphics is visual cohesion. In conjunction with toning up the detail of the environments, Game Freak toned down the detail of the Pokemon models, bringing them closer together in a middle ground. They've removed the textures from Pokemon models, seemingly to fix performance, but it helps sell a more cartoony side to the world as opposed to an entirely realistic one. Now, this isn't my favorite choice, as I do personally think that a more detailed environment would look phenomenal with the more detailed textures on the Pokemon models, but it's certainly a better compromise than making the environment be the one to look less detailed, since the city is the only place this game will take place in, and it would really suck if it all looked bad. Now, subjectively, everything looks serviceable, rather than one aspect looking good like the Pokemon models, while the other looks straight up bad like the environment did in Scarlet and Violet. And the art style being exposed this time around is also more tolerable as a product of this middle ground being reached. With SV, the exposed art style was hard to look at most of the time because the graphics lacked cohesion. But here, I do think it's at least tolerable. When looking at everything together, it would be hard to say that this world we're exploring in Pokemon Legends EA doesn't look super inviting. It does look like a world I want to dive into and be a part of. I want to immerse myself in it, and so far it looks like there isn't much, if anything, to pull me out of that experience. And therein lies my lesson of this video. The game looks good enough to play. It looks like a genuine Switch game. I get it. Pokemon should be doing better, but it was never going to look like Power World on Switch 1. Not that I'm blaming the Switch 1 for Game Freak's lack of fidelity. There are plenty of Switch 1 games that look phenomenal, even with more complex systems and gameplay in place. Like, this really does seem to be a Game Freak specific problem. They really are inviting this discourse on themselves, like I've said many times. We should critique Game Freak when they deserve it. Y'all should do it. I do it. Hell, I just did it in this video. But it's also worth acknowledging when things are done right and keeping context in mind. We should want what's best for the franchise, but we can't cry wolf every time. Now, with that being said, do let us know your thoughts on the graphics down below in a respectful manner, and we can all have a discussion there about it. Afterwards, check out that video I promised you where I explain all the performance saving techniques Game Freak is implementing in ZA. The link is right in front of you and down in the pinned comment. Also, if you like what I do, want to support me and have your name featured at the end of all of my videos, feel free to join my Patreon linked right in front of you and in the description, or become a channel member. I've been johtojonny, and I'll catch you all there.